I like competition.
I know you.
Yeah.
When you're on 26 years, I mean, where's the challenge?
Gives you a charge.
Yeah, but what do you need a charge? 26 years. Walk away. It's over.
Yeah.
Johnny Carson hosted more than 23,000 interviews during his 3-decade reign on The Tonight Show. But behind that polished grin and effortless charm, there were a handful of guests who didn't just make him laugh, they stayed with him. Some challenged him, some surprised him, and a few even caught him completely off guard. Out of the thousands who sat across that famous desk, Carson quietly named just 8 as his all-time favorites. And the reasons why might not be what you expect. There was something about Don Rickles that no one else could replicate. Every time he stepped onto the stage, Carson braced himself, not for a routine, but for an ambush of pure, unscripted chaos. Rickles didn't just tell jokes. He dismantled the host right in front of America. He mocked Johnny's timing, his expressions, even his hairline, and somehow made it all feel like an inside joke between old friends. Most guests tried to impress Carson. Rickles tried to disarm him, and that's what made Johnny love him. Carson once called Rickles the only man who could insult me and get away with it. Their chemistry wasn't rehearsed. It was dangerous in the best way possible. During one memorable night, when Rickles accidentally broke Carson's prized cigarette box on air, Johnny waited until the next evening, stormed onto Rickles' own set mid-show, and interrupted filming just to confront him. The audience lost it. The moment became legendary, not because it was planned, but because it revealed how real their friendship was. Behind the scenes, crew members said Johnny would light up whenever Rickles was booked. He knew the interview could go completely off the rails, and that was the thrill. Rickles represented everything late-night television used to be: spontaneous, fearless, and alive. Off camera, their banter continued just the same, full of quick jabs and laughter that never felt forced. Carson admired how Rickles could make insult comedy feel like affection, a rare balance that only true entertainers understood. Even when the jokes hit hard, there was always warmth underneath. When Carson later named his favorite guests, he didn't hesitate. Don Rickles was always near the top of that list because no one else could make the king of late-night crack first, and no one ever made him laugh quite as hard when the cameras stopped rolling. But even that kind of chaos had a softer side, and the next guest proved that sometimes Johnny's laughter came from admiration rather than mayhem. When Steve Martin first walked onto Johnny Carson's stage, he didn't just tell jokes. He redefined what comedy could look like. His humor wasn't built on punchlines or setup. It was a performance of absurdity, a calculated kind of madness that Carson instantly recognized as genius. While most guests hoped to make Johnny laugh, Steve's goal seemed to be making him think, and Carson, a magician and a sharp intellect himself, couldn't get enough of it. Martin had a way of turning the ordinary into the bizarre. A banjo in his hand, an arrow through his head, or an entire routine about nothing that somehow felt like everything. Carson loved it because it broke every rule. He once said off camera that Steve's mind worked like jazz, unpredictable, but perfectly in rhythm. Their exchanges became legendary, not just for the jokes, but for the strange, knowing smiles between them. Two masters recognizing each other's craft. Behind the desk, Johnny didn't just laugh at Steve Martin, he studied him. It was rare for Carson to let a guest completely take over the room, but Martin's offbeat timing had a gravitational pull. Every time he appeared, the studio air shifted, quieter, sharper, as if everyone was waiting to see what reality he'd twist next. Even the crew would lean in during rehearsals, knowing they might witness something that had never been done before. Steve was chaos disguised as control, and Johnny appreciated every note of it. If Don Rickles brought out Johnny's wild side, Steve Martin revealed his curiosity, the part of Carson that admired intellect disguised as insanity. He saw in Steve a reflection of his own comedic mind, methodical, playful, and never satisfied with easy laughter. But as much as Johnny loved wit, his next favorite guest didn't rely on cleverness at all. He came armed with pure energy and a lifetime of feeling like the world finally noticed him. Few guests made Johnny Carson lose control the way Rodney Dangerfield did. The moment Rodney walked onto that stage, sweating, nervous, and already talking before he even reached the chair, the audience knew what was coming. A storm of one-liners that barely gave anyone a second to breathe. "I get no respect," he'd start. And Carson would already be wiping tears from his eyes. It wasn't just the jokes. It was the rhythm, the desperation, the honesty. Rodney wasn't performing. He was confessing. Carson admired that. He knew the road Rodney took to get there. Decades of rejection, failed gigs, and endless nights of doubt before the world finally caught up to him. Johnny had been there himself in his early days, and that shared battle for validation made their connection personal. When Carson invited him back again and again, it wasn't just because he killed every time. It was because Johnny respected him. He saw a man who'd built an empire out of pain and timing, a man who turned anxiety into art. Off camera, crew members said Carson would sometimes stand in the wings just to watch Rodney's openings, still laughing even after hearing them dozens of times. During commercial breaks, Johnny would lean over, half smiling, and whisper, "You're on fire tonight," which for him was the highest form of praise. Their chemistry was simple, but electric. Carson didn't interrupt. He let Rodney go. He wanted viewers to see what relentless persistence looked like when it finally found a spotlight. And every time Rodney hit a punchline that sent the audience roaring, Johnny's grin said everything. This guy earned it. If Rickles was the chaos and Martin the intellect, then Dangerfield was the soul, the raw, imperfect truth behind every comedian who ever bombed before they broke through. But Carson's admiration didn't stop at the punchline. His next favorite guest wasn't even a comedian. She brought animals, unpredictability, and a kind of joy that melted Johnny's famously calm exterior. Joan Embry had a way of making even Johnny Carson lose his legendary composure. He was a master of control, smooth, composed, and always one step ahead. But the moment Joan walked out carrying a creature that looked like it belonged on another planet, that control vanished. She wasn't a comedian or a movie star. She was an animal handler from the San Diego Zoo, yet somehow she became one of Carson's most beloved guests. Each appearance felt like a ticking time bomb. 1 minute, she'd be calmly explaining the habits of a baby chimpanzee. The next, Johnny would be flinching as a snake wrapped itself around his neck, or a bird decided to relieve itself on his suit. The audience lived for it. The sight of the unshakable Carson breaking character, laughing uncontrollably or squirming in mock terror. And Joan, always poised and patient, just kept smiling through it all, unfazed by the chaos she'd unleashed. What made her special wasn't just the animals, it was the chemistry. Carson adored how naturally she could make chaos feel wholesome. There was no script, no ego, no fame chase, just genuine wonder and unfiltered moments that reminded millions why they tuned in every night. For Johnny, who spent years surrounded by actors and polished personas, Joan was refreshingly real. Even when an armadillo ran loose on stage or a monkey clung to his hair, he couldn't help but laugh like a kid again. Behind the scenes, Johnny reportedly requested her more often than almost any other recurring guest. He'd tell the producers, "Let's bring Joan back. She keeps me honest." She brought out a version of him the audience rarely saw, the curious kid behind the legend. And in a way, she reminded him, and everyone watching, that unpredictability was still the heart of good television. But laughter and warmth were only one side of Johnny's favorites. His next pick brought elegance, heartbreak, and one of the most emotional farewells in television history. For more than 30 years, Johnny Carson rarely let his emotions show. He was the calm center of late-night television, smooth, controlled, untouchable. But when Bette Midler took the stage for his final week on The Tonight Show, something shifted. The moment she began to sing "One for My Baby" and "One More for the Road," the audience could see what words never captured: the end of an era and the breaking of a man who almost never broke. Bette wasn't just a performer. She was an energy. Every appearance she made felt like a celebration wrapped in unpredictability. She joked, she flirted, she sang, and she always found a way to make Johnny blush. Carson admired her fearlessness, that bold mix of humor and heart that few guests could balance. She didn't just entertain. She filled the room in a way that pulled Johnny out from behind his armor. But it was their last moment together that sealed her place as one of his all-time favorites. When she finished singing, Carson's eyes welled up. The studio fell silent, And for a brief moment, the king of late night looked vulnerable. Even the band seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't rehearsed or polished. It was human. That's what made the moment legendary. Bette Midler didn't just say goodbye to Johnny Carson. She said goodbye to an era of television built on sincerity and timing, not algorithms or viral clips. In that instant, the laughter, the applause, and the decades of showbiz melted into something simple and real: gratitude. Years later, when fans talk about Carson's greatest moments, that performance always comes up. Because for once, Johnny wasn't the host, the comedian, or the observer. He was the audience, watching someone he genuinely loved take a final bow. But Johnny's favorites weren't only the ones who made him emotional. Some made him laugh so hard he couldn't breathe. And one guest in particular had that power every single time he showed up. Bob Uecker wasn't a superstar athlete, a movie icon, or a famous comic when he first appeared on The Tonight Show. He was a former backup catcher who turned failure into the funniest career in sports. And that was exactly why Johnny Carson loved him. Uecker didn't take himself seriously. He didn't need to. His timing, his humility, and his stories about life in the major leagues were pure gold. Comedy pulled straight from the dugout of real life. Whenever Bob showed up, Johnny's guard dropped. Their conversations felt like two friends sitting at a bar, one telling stories so outrageous you weren't sure if they were true, and the other laughing so hard he could barely breathe. Uecker would talk about striking out against legends, about sitting on the bench so often that the stadium hot dog vendors knew him by name. Carson ate it up. He once told his staff, "You can't write comedy better than that." What made Uecker's appearances special was how naturally they fit into Johnny's rhythm. There was no setup, no performance, just effortless, authentic storytelling that made everyone feel like part of the joke. Even when the punchlines came, they felt like shared secrets rather than scripted lines. Carson admired that. In a world full of polished celebrities, Uecker reminded the audience that ordinary life could be extraordinary if you told it right. Behind the curtain, Johnny often referred to Bob as a natural. Their chemistry wasn't built on fame, it was built on timing, truth, and that rare ability to laugh at yourself without ever seeming small. Off camera, Johnny would grin and say, "That guy could make a brick wall laugh." For Carson, Uecker represented the kind of humor television was losing: honest, unfiltered, and rooted in real life. But the next guest was different. He didn't trade in small talk or self-deprecation. Instead, he mirrored Johnny's own style: calm, clever, and quietly devastating in his delivery. Some comedians roar. Bob Newhart whispered. He could make an entire audience collapse with laughter using nothing but silence, a stutter, and a phone call that existed entirely in his imagination. Johnny Carson adored that. It was comedy stripped to its purest form: timing, rhythm, and the courage to let the punchline breathe. Whenever Newhart appeared on The Tonight Show, the room changed. He didn't need to chase attention. It came to him naturally. His calm delivery made Carson lean in, not out. There was an unspoken respect between them. Two men who understood that the real magic wasn't in the joke itself, but in how it landed. Carson often said that Newhart's brilliance came from what he didn't say, and he meant it. Their friendship went beyond the stage. Off camera, they shared the same dry humor and mutual admiration for the craft. Newhart once mentioned that Carson had perfect comedic instincts, and Johnny returned the compliment, calling Bob the best listener in comedy. Watching them together felt like eavesdropping on a private conversation between two masters. No ego, no competition, just rhythm and trust. What Carson loved most about Newhart was his restraint. In a world of loud punchlines and over-the-top characters, Bob's comedy was a reminder that intelligence could be funny, that less could still be more. He didn't perform at the audience. He invited them in. And while Carson thrived on unpredictability, he always knew what he'd get from Newhart: consistency, class, and an understated kind of genius. But the last name on Johnny's list was different. He wasn't a polished showman or a calculated craftsman. He was pure instinct, a performer who lived entirely in the moment. David Brenner wasn't the loudest or flashiest guest Johnny Carson ever invited, but he might have been the most relatable. He came from the streets of Philadelphia, built his act from scratch, and turned his sharp, observational humor into something that felt universal. When he first appeared on The Tonight Show, Carson instantly saw what others missed: a storyteller who could make everyday life sound like a confession, and a comedy act all at once. Brenner ended up becoming one of the show's most frequent guests, appearing more than 70 times, and even guest hosting the program. But his connection with Johnny went deeper than just airtime. Carson saw himself in Brenner, a man who studied his craft, respected the moment, and understood that humor was a way to survive the chaos of the world. Every time Brenner walked onto that stage, Johnny relaxed, because he knew the audience was in good hands. Unlike some comedians who relied on characters or gimmicks, Brenner's style was grounded in truth. He talked about the absurdity of real life, relationships, politics, the weird quirks of being human. Carson loved that balance between honesty and humor. It was simple but powerful, and it made sense that Brenner became part of Johnny's inner circle of favorites, not just as a performer, but as a man who reminded him why comedy mattered in the first place. In a lineup filled with legends, Brenner represented the working comic, the grinder who earned every laugh through experience and persistence. To Johnny, he was proof that fame didn't have to change who you were. It could simply amplify your voice. And that voice, honest, funny, and endlessly curious, was exactly what Johnny Carson built his entire career celebrating. Because in the end, Carson's favorite guests weren't just entertainers. They were reflections of himself, sharp, spontaneous, flawed, and deeply human. When you look back at Johnny Carson's 8 favorite guests, you see more than just late-night television. You see the blueprint for entertainment itself. Don Rickles brought chaos. Steve Martin brought intellect. Rodney Dangerfield brought raw honesty. Joan Embry brought wonder. Bette Midler brought emotion. Bob Uecker brought real-life humor. Bob Newhart brought quiet genius. And David Brenner brought heart. Each one pulled a different version of Johnny out from behind the host's mask. The prankster, the thinker, the dreamer, the friend. Together, they revealed the man behind the legend, someone who didn't just crave laughter, but connection. That's what made Carson timeless. Even decades later, these moments still feel alive. Proof that great television doesn't come from the perfect script, but from real chemistry, surprise, and a little bit of risk. And if you've ever found yourself missing that kind of magic, the kind that could only happen once, in front of a live audience, you're not alone. If you enjoyed this dive into Johnny Carson's world, make sure to like this video, subscribe for more stories from the golden age of entertainment, and drop a comment below telling us which Carson guest was your favorite. You might be surprised how many people remember the same moments you do, because for millions of viewers, those late-night laughs weren't just television, they were memories.